At 11:59 p.m. on December 31, 1999, the world held its breath. In Times Square, 1 million people stood in the freezing cold, counting down the seconds to midnight. But this was not a normal New Year's celebration. This was a countdown to the apocalypse. Across the globe, governments had stockpiled food and water. Hospitals had backup generators on standby. The military was on high alert. Banks had printed extra cash in case ATMs stopped working. Airlines had grounded planes. Nuclear power plants had additional staff monitoring their systems. Families had filled bathtubs with water and bought candles in case the electricity failed. Some people had built bunkers. Religious cults predicted the end of the world. The panic was real, and it was all because of a problem called Y2K. The year 2000 bug, the millennium bug, the digital catastrophe that was going to destroy civilization. Computers, the experts warned, were going to fail at midnight. Banking systems would collapse. Air traffic control would go dark. The stock market would crash, hospital equipment would malfunction, the electrical grid would shut down. And all because, decades earlier, programmers had used 2 digits instead of 4 to store the year in computer code. When the calendar rolled over from 1999 to 2000, computers would think it was the year 1900, and the entire digital infrastructure of the modern world would implode. At least, that's what we were told. The fear was so intense that the world spent over $300 billion trying to fix the problem. It was the largest IT project in human history. Consultants made fortunes, software companies printed money, governments poured billions into remediation efforts. And when midnight finally struck, when the ball dropped in Times Square and the year 2000 began, the world waited for the chaos. And nothing happened. The planes did not fall from the sky. The banks did not collapse, the power stayed on, the nukes did not launch, the apocalypse did not come. The question that haunts us today is simple. Was Y2K ever a real threat, or was it the greatest scam in history? A manufactured crisis that made billions for IT companies while the rest of us lived in fear. This is the story of how the tech industry weaponized fear, how governments panicked, and how the world spent a fortune preparing for a disaster that never came. To understand the Y2K hysteria, we need to go back to the 1960s, when computers were the size of rooms and memory was insanely expensive. In those days, computer storage was measured in kilobytes, not gigabytes. Every single byte mattered. Programmers had to be ruthlessly efficient, so when they wrote code to store dates, they made a decision that seemed perfectly logical at the time. Instead of storing the full year, 1965, they stored only the last 2 digits, 65. It saved memory, it saved money. And since these programs were only supposed to run for a few years, no one thought it would be a problem. But those programs did not get replaced, they got built upon. Layer after layer of new code was added on top of the old code. By the 1990s, the world's entire financial system, its infrastructure, its communications networks, all of it was running on software that had been written decades earlier. Software that stored years as 2 digits. And that meant that on January 1, 2000, when the date rolled over from 99 to 00, computers would interpret 00 as 1900, not 2000. The logic of the code would break, date calculations would fail, systems would crash. Or at least, that was the theory. The problem was real. But the question was, how bad would it actually be? And that's where the fear began to spiral out of control. In 1996, a writer named Peter de Jager published an article in Computer World magazine titled Doomsday 2000. He warned that Y2K could cause catastrophic failures in everything from elevators to pacemakers. The article went viral, in the pre-internet sense of the word. It was picked up by mainstream media. Television news started running stories about the coming digital apocalypse. The narrative was simple and terrifying. Modern civilization depended on computers, and the computers were about to fail. Once the media got hold of the story, the panic accelerated. Consultants and IT experts appeared on television, warning that the problem was far worse than anyone realized. Some claimed that planes would literally fall out of the sky at midnight because their navigation systems would fail. Others said that nuclear power plants might melt down. The Social Security Administration warned that benefit payments might stop. The IRS warned that tax refunds might not be processed. The Pentagon admitted that some of its weapons systems might be affected, and every single one of these warnings came with the same message: you need to hire us to fix it. And hire them they did. Governments around the world launched massive Y2K remediation programs. The United States alone spent an estimated $100 billion. The private sector spent another $200 billion globally. AT consulting firms like IBM, EDS, and Accenture made billions. Small software companies that specialized in COBOL, the ancient programming language used in most legacy systems, suddenly found themselves in high demand. Programmers who had retired were brought back at premium rates to comb through millions of lines of code, searching for date bugs. It was a gold rush. Every company with a computer system was terrified. And the consultants were more than happy to feed that fear. They warned that doing nothing was not an option. They said that even if there was only a 10% chance of catastrophic failure, the risk was too great to ignore. Boards of directors, terrified of lawsuits, approved budgets without hesitation. No one wanted to be the CEO who ignored Y2K and caused a disaster. But here's the thing, most of the remediation work was not fixing critical bugs. It was theater. Companies paid consultants millions of dollars to audit systems that were not vulnerable. They replaced hardware that did not need to be replaced. They rewrote code that was working fine. Why? Because no one knew what was actually at risk. The fear was so pervasive that the default strategy was to spend money on everything, just in case. The IT consulting industry sold fear the way insurance companies sell policies. They did not promise to prevent disaster. They promised to protect you from blame. If you spent the money and hired the consultants, and something went wrong anyway, you could point to the millions you spent and say, "We did everything we could." But if you did nothing, and something went wrong, you were finished. So companies spent, and spent, and spent. There were real Y2K bugs. Some systems did need to be fixed, but the actual scale of the critical vulnerabilities was nowhere near what the media and the consultants claimed, and the evidence for this is what happened when the clock struck midnight. Nothing. In some countries, governments and businesses had done almost nothing to prepare. Italy spent very little on Y2K remediation. Russia largely ignored the problem, and when January 1st, 2000 arrived in those countries, there were no catastrophic failures, no planes crashed, no power grids collapsed. There were minor glitches. A few ATMs stopped working. Some websites displayed the wrong date. A few government systems had errors, but nothing critical failed. Nothing even close to the apocalypse that had been predicted. So what actually happened? Did the $300 billion in spending prevent a disaster? Or was the disaster never going to happen in the first place? The IT industry insists that the money was well spent. They argue that the reason nothing bad happened was precisely because of all the remediation work. They say that without the massive investment, there would have been widespread failures. But there's a problem with that argument. It's unfalsifiable. You can never prove that spending prevented something that did not happen. It's like claiming that your rock keeps tigers away. Do you see any tigers? No? Then the rock works. The reality is that most of the dire predictions were based on worst-case scenarios that assumed every possible thing would go wrong at the same time. The consultants modeled catastrophic cascading failures. But systems don't work that way. Most computer failures are isolated. They don't cause other systems to fail. A banking system that thinks it's 1900 might stop processing transactions, but it's not going to cause the electrical grid to shut down. The other problem with the "we saved the world" narrative is that it ignores all the systems that were not fixed and did not fail. There were millions of embedded systems, small computers inside devices like elevators, traffic lights, and industrial equipment that were never checked for Y2K compliance. And nothing happened to them either. If the threat was as severe as claimed, these unfixed systems should have failed. They didn't. The Y2K crisis was a perfect storm of genuine technical debt, media hysteria, corporate liability panic, and profit-seeking opportunism. There was a kernel of truth at the center. Yes, some old systems had date bugs that needed to be fixed. But that kernel was inflated into an existential threat by people who had a financial incentive to terrify the public. The IT consulting industry made a fortune, and they were not the only ones. Survivalists and doomsday preppers sold bunkers, freeze-dried food, and water purification tablets. Authors published books like The Millennium Bug, How to Survive the Coming Chaos, that became bestsellers. Televangelists preached that Y2K was a sign of the end times and asked for donations to prepare. There was even a cottage industry of Y2K lawyers who advised companies on how to protect themselves from lawsuits in case their systems failed. Everyone was making money from the fear. The only people who did not profit were the ones who paid the bills, the taxpayers and the shareholders. Governments diverted billions from other priorities to fund Y2K programs. Companies spent money that could have been invested in innovation or paid to employees. And for what? To fix a problem that in most cases was not going to cause the disasters that were predicted. The ultimate irony is that the legacy systems that everyone was so worried about, the ancient COBOL code running on mainframes, turned out to be far more resilient than anyone expected. These systems had been running for decades. They had survived hardware failures, power outages, and software bugs. They were robust, and the idea that they would all spontaneously fail at midnight because of a date rollover was always more fiction than fact. But the most disturbing aspect of the Y2K story is not the wasted money, it's the precedent it set. Y2K taught the world a lesson. If you can manufacture a crisis, you can make billions. The IT industry learned that fear sells, and they have used that playbook ever since. Every few years, there is a new digital threat, a new reason to spend billions on consulting and software. Cybersecurity is the obvious example. The cybersecurity industry is now worth over $200 billion a year, and just like Y2K, it is built on fear. Companies are told that hackers are everywhere, that breaches are inevitable, and that if they don't spend money on the latest security software, they will be destroyed. Is the threat real? Yes. Are some of the products and services necessary? Absolutely. But is the scale of spending justified by the actual risk? That's debatable. Just like Y2K, the cybersecurity industry profits from worst-case scenarios and the inability to prove a negative. You can never prove that your security spending prevented an attack that did not happen. The same pattern repeats with artificial intelligence. We are now being told that AI is an existential threat to humanity, that if we don't regulate it, control it, and spend billions managing it, it will destroy us all. The people making these warnings are, conveniently, the same people who stand to profit from AI regulation and AI safety consulting. It's Y2K all over again. Manufacture the fear, sell the solution, profit. The real victims of Y2K were not the people who paid for the fixes. The real victims were the public's trust in expertise. Before Y2K, when experts said there was a crisis, people believed them. After Y2K, a significant portion of the public became skeptical. They had been told the sky was falling. They had watched governments and corporations spend hundreds of billions of dollars, and then nothing happened. This created a credibility gap. When the next real crisis came along, climate change, pandemics, financial collapses, a large segment of the population no longer trusted the experts. They remembered Y2K. They remembered being told to panic, and they remembered that the panic was overblown. This is the hidden cost of crying wolf. When you exaggerate a threat for profit, you don't just waste money, you erode trust. And when trust is gone, it's almost impossible to get it back. Today, we live in an age of constant crisis. Every year there is a new existential threat, a new reason to be afraid. And every time, there are consultants, experts, and industries ready to sell you the solution. Some of these threats are real, some are exaggerated, and some are completely manufactured. The challenge is knowing the difference. Y2K should have taught us to ask hard questions, to demand evidence, to be skeptical of worst-case scenarios, to distinguish between real risk and fear-mongering. But instead, it taught the fear merchants that the business model works, and so the cycle continues. On January 1, 2000, as the sun rose over a world that had not ended, there was a brief moment of collective embarrassment. The planes were still flying, the banks were still open, the banks were still open, the power was still on. People looked at their stockpiles of canned food and bottled water and laughed nervously. The media quickly moved on. There were a few articles asking whether the threat had been overstated, but they were drowned out by the IT industry's victory lap. The consultants and the software companies declared that the reason nothing bad happened was because of their hard work. They took credit for saving the world. And the public, relieved that disaster had been averted, did not ask too many questions. But the questions should have been asked. How much of the $300 billion was actually necessary? How many of the dire predictions were based on real analysis versus speculation? Who profited from the panic? And why were there no consequences for the people who exaggerated the threat? These questions were never answered, and so the lesson was never learned. 25 years later, the Y2K scam remains one of the most successful examples of manufactured crisis in history. It proved that if you can scare people enough, they will pay almost anything, and the people who scared them will walk away rich without ever having to prove that the threat was real. The greatest New Year's scam was not just the billions that were wasted. It was the realization that fear is the most profitable product in the world, and the people selling it are very, very good at their job. This is Financial Injustice. Subscribe to recognize the system before it shapes you.